All right, everybody. In this brief video, I'm going to be going over some basic themes in pre-Socratic cosmology. And if you need a sort of refresher on the context in which this conversation is taking place, I would encourage you to look up some aspects of Greek mythology and the role that Greek mythology plays in ancient Greece. All right, so just to recap, a couple of things here. It's commonly asserted that philosophy in the West begins when the philosopher Thales is able to successfully predict a solar eclipse in 585 BCE. Now, and what was unique about this event in history was that when Thales did this, he only used math and astronomy. So if you think about the mythological context in which this kind of prediction took place, so Thales is operating in a time when it's common to believe that there are these superhuman divine agents behind the natural world, and this included the movement of celestial bodies and things like that. Okay, so what that means is in a mythological sort of context, um, for those that believe the myth and sort of center their lives and their culture around the myth, a successful explanation is one that invokes divine activities in this way. Okay, but Thales, by only referring to math and astronomy, leaves that kind of supernatural or divine part of the explanation out of the equation. All right. Now, and given the important role that mythology played in ancient Greece at this time, this kind of explanation, or proposed explanation rather, would have really cut against the grain, against society. So, if you remember, myths not only play an important explanatory role, like why do these kinds of natural phenomena occur? Well, because there are these superhuman actors kind of working behind the scenes, bringing order to the chaos. Um, so, what cosmology is an attempt to explain nature in accordance with natural mechanics. So the process of cosmology is to attempt to give explanations for natural reality by referring to things that are themselves elements or components of that natural reality. So there's not something which transcends the natural world, if you will, that is kind of outside of it and yet is interacting within it, like gods or divine kinds of things as sort of transcendent beings. Okay, but not only did this cut against the grain about that aspect of mythology, myths also provided a sense of cultural and social cohesion. So the mythology was largely unquestioned. Feast days and festivals and holidays and the laws and the culture and all of those kinds of things were centered around the mythology. Your very way of life was dependent upon acceptance of the mythology, as was the case with the philosopher Socrates. Your loyalty to your country or your loyalty to your city state was viewed as being directly correlated to um, your loyalty to the approved gods and goddesses of the particular country or city state that you lived in. So, being a loyal practitioner of the mythology was a way for any given society or city state or country to demand loyalty of its members. I mean, so if you live in Athens, you live in Athena's city. Well, obviously, if we have certain beliefs about Athena, about what Athena values, and about the kinds of character traits that Athena has, our laws and the way we organize ourselves socially are going to be centered around those kinds of values. They're going to be centered around those kinds of character traits that Athena values. Okay, and if you come along asking questions which might cause individuals to speculate about Athena's nature. I mean, maybe Athena isn't as involved in the world as we think she is, or maybe Athena exists but doesn't we quite don't have the right kind of beliefs about Athena that's reported in the mythology, those kinds of things. Um, Obviously, to question Athena is to question Athens, and to question Athens is to question Athena. So there's not a situation of like a separation of church and state here. Okay, and then thirdly, obviously, the mythology provides a certain kind of psychological control over nature, if you will. So nature is chaotic and nature is working against us. But if there are these superhuman divine actors working behind the scenes, well, maybe theoretically we can get nature to work for us rather than against us. So in a day and an age where survival is a constant preoccupation, um, mythology does play that important preservative sort of function. It not only is a guard against the chaos of nature, it's a guard against our society or our country or our civilization becoming chaotic in the same way that nature is chaotic. So there's this sharp line between the order of our civilized society and a world which is just constantly uncaring and apathetic about our moral efforts. At the end of the day, we kind of need to believe um, that there's something more that explains things more than just what we see in nature, because again, nature is chaotic. Okay, but Thales is not trying to eliminate the gods here. So Thales says two things here. He says that reality is fundamentally water, and he was kind of right about this and kind of wrong about this. So, what kinds of properties of water would lead Thales to think this way? Okay, well, first of all, water is constantly moving and it can take on a variety of different states. Um, it's essential for life, and Thales or Aristotle indicates that Thales probably suspected that water was essential for life, but kind of didn't really know how correct he was about that. But it's also everywhere. So it's constantly moving. It takes on a variety of states. It's essential for life, and it's everywhere. You dig in the ground, you're going to hit water. You walk far enough in any direction, you're going to hit a body of water. It falls down from the rain, the sky. It goes up into the sky as a gas. All of these kinds of things. And if we look at the fact that we live in a world where nature is moving and constantly in flux and those kinds of things, this answer seems to make a whole lot of sense. Okay, so Thales says that everything is water and also everything contains gods. So the previous picture is the gods are kind of like outside the natural order of things. They're transcendent. What Thales does is he moves things in the other directions. No, the gods are not transcendent, kind of outside the realm of nature. If everything contains gods, then the gods are just as much a part of nature as sticks and water and earth and fire and wind and everything else is. Um, so rather than kind of keep the gods outside of this realm, the realm of nature. If everything contains gods, then the gods are just as much a part of nature and everything. So it's not strange to talk about everything containing gods any more than it's strange to talk about a lot of things containing water, or a lot of things containing earth, or a lot of things containing fire. The gods are just as much a natural component of this world as those other kinds of elements are. Now, but the role that the gods play in terms of everything being made or everything containing gods, um, Thales is recognizing that nature has its own kind of rational order. So, a constant theme that comes up with the pre Socratic cosmologists is how is it that we have a world which is intelligible, which we can make successful predictions about, like solar eclipse? there seems to be a certain coherent, rational ordering process which brings order to the chaos of nature. So, in as much as nature is unpredictable, it is very much predictable. To the extent that nature cannot be contained, we can utilize natural resources to work for us rather than against us. We can grow food, we can predict weather, we can recognize the changing of the seasons, we can measure the movement of celestial bodies and things like this. So there has to be some explanation for the fact that we, in as much as it seems to be chaotic, it also seems to be law governed. But by Thales moving the gods into nature itself and talking about how everything contains gods. He's saying that it's not like there are these divine beings outside of the realm of nature, kind of directly tinkering with nature. We're not talking about, like, the grand watchmaker, as other individuals say. No, nature itself has a rational order to it, a coherent law governing ordering process to it. So that is why we can explain nature naturally. We can explain things, we can explain phenomena and events that occur in the natural order in accordance with perfectly natural mechanics. Okay, so that's the main idea here, and that's a central theme that is going to come up with a lot of these pre-Socratic cosmologists. Okay, now another important concern here, ultimately, that these pre-Socratic cosmologists were concerned with was this notion of substance. Okay, and this term gets used a lot, and it's also going to continue on through thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, even into the medieval period of philosophy, the modern period of philosophy, and even today, some philosophers, even contemporarily, find this notion of substance to be a useful one or an important one. Okay, now, but etymologically, this is just the history of the word. Okay, so the word substance comes from the Greek word ousia, which means being, and the Greek word ousia, which means being, is translated via the Latin word substantia, which means that which stands under or grounds. Okay, so according to this kind of way of using the word, to talk about substance, or to talk about substances, or to talk about the most basic constituents of reality. Okay, so when we're talking about substance in this way, we're using the term to denote that which is fundamental. Meaning, if you kind of had to break reality down or divide reality up into types, and if you're interested more in talking about types, I would encourage you to look up the Introduction to Metaphysics videos on my channel. There's two of them, Introduction to Metaphysics 1 and Introduction to Metaphysics 2. If we had to divide reality up into types or categories, how many distinct kinds of categories would we need? That's fundamentally the concern here. So if we had categories of types, or kind of a taxonomy of reality, where our categories literally refer to distinctions in the world, and that's an important kind of qualification that we need to make here. So some of our categories might be completely socially constructed or artificial, meaning that we might have a category for something that does not directly correspond to genuine or actual features or properties that the world actually has. So these would be artificial distinctions. Now, but if we're talking about categories that genuinely refer to a way of dividing reality up into types, how many unique types of categories or kinds of categories would we need? Now, and when we're talking about unique categories, we mean categories which are distinct, meaning that you can't really explain one in terms of the other. So we can talk about this in terms of, like, second order or first order, or complex and simple, right? Okay, so there's at least three important ways of talking about substance here. Okay, so the first way is to just do what I just referred to talk about the basic building blocks of reality. So if you had to divide reality up to its most basic elements, those basic, whatever you're left with, when you divide reality up into types, would be the basic building blocks of reality. Okay, now, but it's here we need to make a distinction between something being physically divisible and something being metaphysically divisible. Obviously, being physically divisible, you have to be physical. Yeah, right. So, in order for something to be physically divisible, that means that it has to be composed of physical kind of stuff, or constituted at least of physical kind of stuff, such that you can kind of cut it up into chunks, right? Okay, but something can be metaphysically divisible without being physically divisible. So suppose, for the sake of simplicity, um, suppose that there are existing things that we call spirits, meaning that if something is a spirit, it is not identical to any physical object, nor does it have any proper parts that are physical. Okay, but if spirits have distinct features or properties, such that those features or properties are indivisible to each other, and let's just assume for a moment that any given spirit like this just would be identical to its properties. Well, on this assumption, then, if a spirit just is a bundle of properties and it has distinct properties, then that means that the spirit, the ghost, whatever, would be divisible into parts. Now, again, they wouldn't be physical parts, but they would nevertheless be parts. Okay, so if the fact that spirits are conscious um, has nothing to do with the fact that spirits are invisible, so I take it that if there are spirits, they would be conscious, and I also take it that they would be invisible. But if these two properties are irreducible to each other, and the spirit, just as an object, is nothing more, um, than a bundle of properties, then the nature of the spirit just is it's a bundle of properties. It doesn't have one properties; it has distinct properties. Then the fact that the spirit is conscious, and the fact that the spirit is invisible, and the fact that the spirit can't interact with physical reality, whatever, these would all be distinct features of the spirit. Well, that means that you can technically divide the spirit into parts. So just because something is metaphysically divisible doesn't mean that it is physically divisible. Okay, now clearly anything which is physically divisible is also metaphysically divisible, but not vice versa. All right. Okay, now the second concern for substance here is to talk about that which is explanatorily primitive. Aha, okay. Now, what does it mean for something to be explanatorily primitive? So, again, if we had to divide reality into levels, um, and so we have higher order complexities, and then we have lower order complexities, right? A lot of philosophers typically think of explanation in terms of what it means to explain is to sort of decomplexify. So if we've got a complex level of reality, let's just call that level 3, and that's in some sense dependent upon a lower order reality 2, a simpler level of reality. To explain level 3 in terms of level 2, right, is just to say that level 3 is kind of a special case of level 2. All right, and then maybe level 2 is explained in terms of level 1. So what it means to say that a given level of complexity is explanatorily primitive means that there's nothing simpler to explain that level in terms of. So if we explain level 3 in terms of level 2, level 3 just is a special case of level 2, and we explain level 2 in terms of level 1 and the like, the idea is that eventually um, our explanations need to terminate somewhere. Our explanations need to terminate somewhere. So we can't have an an infinite regression of explanation. So you can't explain A in terms of B and B in terms of C and C in terms of D and D in terms of E and E in terms of F. You can't just have this infinite chain of explanation. Why? Because, you know, so goes the argument. If you've got an infinite chain of explanation, what that ultimately means is you have no explanation at all. So if any subsection of the chain is going to be explained by something prior to it, you just can't keep adding levels of explanation because, because there's no explanation for why we have an infinite chain in the first place. Infinite chains don't have explanations. Now, but if an infinite chain has no explanation, then that means no single element of the chain has an explanation either. Why? What is the chain? The chain is just its elements. So if an infinite chain has no explanation for its existence, and the infinite chain is just the conjunction of its various elements, if the chain has no explanation, then no individual element of the chain has no explanation either, or at least so goes the argument. Okay, so the idea is that our explanations need to terminate somewhere. So what is a substance? Well, a substance it would be explanatorily primitive in that regard. Okay. Now, and then the third and final way of talking about substance is to talk about that which endures through change. Okay. So to the extent that I, John, can survive the loss of a few hairs. I mean, believe it or not, but I did at one point in time have a full head of hair, and it was just as red as my beard is. All right, but I think the person sitting in front of you recording this video is numerically identical to the person 18 years ago who had a full head of red hair and was a college student, right? A young college student. If I were to lose one of my beard hairs just in the process of going like this, I don't think so if prior to losing a hair, I have X number of hairs, I think it's reasonable to say that the individual who has X minus one hairs is numerically identical to the individual who has X number of hairs. I think I can survive the loss of a hair. Okay, well, what that means then, if I can survive the loss of a hair, then that means that hair is not an essential feature of me. Okay, now, but this leads to a really pressing question here that the pre-Socratic philosophers and metaphysicians of all different kinds throughout the ages have been concerned with. Okay, how much change can a thing undergo? How much change can a thing undergo and still be the same thing? Now, clearly, if something changes, it's not going to be the same qualitatively, right? So if two things are qualitatively identical, then that means that there is no change. But what kind of qualitative change does there need to be in order to be quantitative change? So, losing a hair, that is a qualitative change. But if the object that has X number of hairs and the object that has X minus one hairs are numerically identical to each other, then that means I'm only talking about one object, not two, right? Okay, let me give you another example. If Batman is numerically identical to Bruce Wayne, then I'm not talking about two distinct objects. I'm talking about one and the same object. Now, but it's also the case that if you want to get technical, you could make the case that Batman wears a mask and Bruce Wayne does not wear a mask. But we're talking about one and the same object, right? So if somebody believed that Batman is not Bruce Wayne, well, because Batman always wears a mask, and I never see Bruce Wayne wear a mask. I've never seen Bruce Wayne wear a mask. It would be a mistake to say that, well, we must be talking about two distinct individuals then. So, and that would be an example of an external change. I mean, so if I can put my hood up, I can put my hood down, right? So I change in relation to other kinds of things, mainly my sweatshirt here. But that's a change. At one moment I've got a hood on, and then the next moment I've got a hood off. I lose a hair, I gain it. I gain atoms and lose atoms, and some of my cells die. So things are constantly changing. Okay, now, and this is going to be a major problem among the pre-Socratic cosmologists, and that is a specific problem known as the problem of the one and the many. Okay, so here's what's at stake. It seems as if we want both two different things to be true. Okay, we want to say that there's only one reality. There's only one universe, and I don't mean universe. Well, I could say world. There's only one world in terms of, and by world I mean the totality of all that there is. By world I don't mean Earth. There's only one world. There's only one totality of being, and yet we also want to say that that one reality is nevertheless made of distinct parts. So reality is one. There's only one reality, but reality is also many, meaning that reality is made of distinct parts. Okay, well, how is this possible? How can reality both be one and also be many at the same time? So when I'm talking about reality, when I'm talking about the world, I'm talking about one thing, but I'm also talking about many things. So there's one reality. Well, what do we mean by reality? Well, the totality of everything that there is. Well, and how many elements are there to that totality? Well, there's more than one. So there's one reality, but that one reality is a totality of more than one kind of thing. So it's one thing and it's not one thing. Duh. Now, and the pre-Socratic cosmologists, particularly Parmenides and Zeno, they're going to have a field day with this. Parmenides says, yeah, it is clear that reality is one, and if reality is one, reality cannot be made of parts. And if reality is one, then reality cannot change in this respect. Okay, now, and this will come up later when we talk about Plato. So even if you think Parmenides is wrong about reality not being made of parts and reality incapable of being changed, incapable of changing, why? Because if things change, then it needs to be possible for something to become what it is not, and we can't talk about things that are not. We can only talk about things that are. But since change means that something can become what it is not, that means something is capable of becoming nothing, but things can't become nothing. Why? There's no such thing as nothing. There are only some things. Okay, so reality must not change. And if reality doesn't change, then there's no way to make distinctions in reality. And if there's no way to make distinctions in reality, then reality is one. Reality cannot be made of proper parts. That's kind of a Parmenidean, if you will, type of argument for why. Okay, if you really want to emphasize and hold to that there's only one reality and that there's a unification to reality, then you have to deny that reality is made of proper parts. You gotta deny that anything in reality actually changes. Now, if you compare what Parmenides says with what the philosopher Heraclitus says, so Parmenides and Zeno emphasize kind of the oneness, the unity of reality. Heraclitus, on the other hand, emphasizes change and tension. So Heraclitus talks about the fact that you can't have reality without tension. All right, so he uses the example of a bow string. The only reason why bow strings work or guitar strings work is because we have opposition of forces, right? If you think about stringing a bow, it's because the bowstring tension is being placed on it that's pulling it in two opposite directions. If that is not the case, you don't have a working bowstring. And that is reality. So what is reality? Reality is that tension, right? The opposition of forces here. Okay. All right. Now, once again, if you want a little more technical sort of way of parsing all of this out, I would encourage you to look into the other two videos on my channel. Both of them are on Introduction to Metaphysics. Okay, but that will suffice for now, and I will see you all soon.